must say that my most direct connection to Watergate was not as a journalist, but as an intern at the Democratic National Committee. And to my Republican friends, I will paraphrase President Bush when he said, when I was young and crazy, I did young and crazy things, and this being one of them. But anyway, I was first at the DNC, which was in the Watergate at that point in the summer of 1970, and then again beginning in July of 72, 1 month after the break-in. And to be charitable, to be very charitable, the DNC then was a political backwater. It was $9 million in debt, many offices were empty, and the place was as quiet as a tomb. And to underscore what Congressman Frey said last night, never has so much been lost for so little. Those are the facts, but determining Watergate's impact on political coverage since then is, I found in pondering this, is somewhat difficult. It was not a standalone event. It was a climax of one of the most volatile decades in American history, starting with the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, following through the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy in 1968, with the backdrop of the Civil Rights Movement, burgeoning and urban rioting, and Vietnam, which was painfully unraveling. Even before Watergate, you were seeing the political scene being roiled, particularly at the national conventions. In 3 straight election years, from 64 through 72, at least one of the major parties held a convention which could have been termed out of control. The 64 Republican Convention at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, I guess you could say the GOP did not put its best foot forward. Same could be said in spades about the Democratic Convention of 68 in Chicago, and the 72 Democratic Convention in Miami Beach, which was so Democratic in nature that the presidential candidate, George McGovern, was not able to give his acceptance speech till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. A very good time for the voters in Guam. In short, by the time of Watergate in the early 1970s, the political world was already changing, as was the media coverage of it, with the result there was a more cynical and aggressive press corps than a decade earlier, assuming a higher profile. If political coverage at the beginning of the 1960s was defined by Teddy White's romantic, lyrical, Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Making of the President, a decade later it was defined more by Timothy Krause's Boys on the Bus, an irreverent look at the irreverent group of reporters who covered the 72 presidential campaign up close and personal. And if the high-profile political journalists in the early 60s were presidential confidants, like Ben Bradley and Hugh Sidey, by the early 70s, they were presidential adversaries like Daniel Schorr and Katharine Graham. Up against this increasingly assertive press came one of the most paranoid administrations ever, particularly with its relationship with the media. Even before the end of the first year in office, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, was attacking nattering nabobs of negativism in reference to the effete Eastern media, and the latter was responding in kind. To Teddy White, in his book, The Making of the President, 1972, he drew up an imaginary hit list that the Nixon White House might have had, which I think is quite plausible, in this order. First, the Washington Post. Second, CBS. Third, the New York Times. Fourth, the North Vietnamese regime in Hanoi. So the result here in the early 1970s was a perfect storm, a pitched fight between press and the president, each claiming to be the true representative of the nation's political mainstream. Well, what is Watergate's legacy in media coverage? I think others on the panel could probably answer this better than I. I must say, Congressional Quarterly, we were a lagging indicator of journalism. I mean, if you know Congressional Quarterly, you go to the reference section of the library, you look for the green binders, it's there with the dictionaries and the World Book and things like that. It's not exactly on the cutting edge of journalism, but that was fine by me. I kind of liked, the analysis aspect of it and the numbers, and I could work with voting trends and things like that as a political reporter. But I wasn't going out, talking to people on background or not on background or things like that. I was talking to academics, people, and, politicians who would generally, on things that weren't terribly controversial. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about the legacy, though I would say this. There seems to be several things that are mentioned as the probable legacy. One is the glamorization of political journalism, certainly an increased status for political reporters that they did not have a generation or so earlier. A rise in investigative reporting and an increased interest in journalism on college campuses. Now, I can speak to the first two at CQ in terms of like the glamorization. CQ did not begin to have bylines for reporters until the mid-1970s, right after Watergate. Whether there's a cause and effect, I don't know, but that's when it happened. And it was before that, it was more of a just the facts, ma'am approach to covering Congress, and there were no names written at the bottom of any of the articles until the mid-70s. And then a few years later, CQ added a beat in the magazine called Inside Congress, which was about as close as CQ would come to investigative reporting. It was kind of a free agent reporter who could cover any rising issue in Congress, cover the leadership, what have you, and not be tied down to a specific beat like judiciary or agriculture, foreign policy, what have you. And as for the third point, the increased interest in journalism, well, I'm an old history major myself. I'm not a journalism major, so I can't really speak to that except noting here last night when Bob Woodward was talking, and one of the questioners who stood up said he got into journalism after reading All the President's Men. That his interest was stirred because of the Watergate reporting. But maybe more important in terms of, here is a change in basic perceptions about the way politics should be conducted after Watergate. Anything associated with the word sunshine became good. Anything associated with behind closed doors was bad. And the increasing transparency in the political world gave political journalists more to cover. By 1976, the campaign of 1976, we had a new campaign finance law in place with disclosure requirements that enabled reporters to follow the bucks. Presidential debates were back after a 16-year hiatus, and there were more presidential primaries, which produced grassroots orientation to the nominating process that was not there before, and as a consequence, longer and longer presidential campaigns. It probably should be noted here that back in '68, Bobby Kennedy did not announce his candidacy for the president until March of 1968, after the New Hampshire primary was held. Hubert Humphrey, who won the nomination, didn't get in until April of 1968, after half the primaries were held. By 1976 campaign, the first after Watergate, Jimmy Carter announced his candidacy in November of 1974, shortly after the midterm elections were held, and he was not alone in entering the race that early. But the transparency in politics didn't stop there. By '79, we had the House of Representatives going on TV, on C-SPAN, an anniversary that was recently has been noted. A few years later, the Senate followed on the television. And in the 1980s, the gotcha journalism that helped to topple Nixon was back in vogue, taking down the candidacies of Gary Hart and Joe Biden in 1987. So all this glitter and transparency are still there, and with probably even more opportunities than ever for journalists to become mini celebrities, with cable TV constantly looking for politically attuned to help fill their huge blocks of time. And as one who's been asked occasionally to go on cable TV, I can say it is indeed a mini celebrity. A buck and, that appearance gets you a cup of coffee, basically. But it looks good. It looks good. Now, I may or may not be right on this, but I have the feeling that journalism these days may be offering the illusion of sunshine and transparency without the real thing. When I left CQ in the late 1990s, journalists there were increasingly being stretched thin. Not only were they supplying copy to the weekly magazine, but for the midday faxes, daily newsletter, and God knows what else. There was less and less time to do the deeper analytical pieces that were once a staple of CQ. It's left me wondering whether we're in an era of journalism where more is less. We have, even with all the media outlets we have now, all the high-speed journalism that is taking place, all the polling of the vox populi, there's so much we don't know about what's going on right now. And I've gotten to the point where I hope I live long enough to read good histories of this period and find out what really happened. And I don't think the long stop-and-start electoral process that has evolved since Watergate has done much good for anybody, the candidates, the reporters, or the voters. At this point in the 1972 campaign, only 3 states had held their presidential primaries: New Hampshire, Florida, and Illinois. The Democratic nominating process that year would go on to the convention, which was followed by a post-Labor Day general election campaign. The process back then had a continuity to it that we don't have now. Then there was an 8-month nominating process, a 2-month general election campaign. Now we have the reverse of that, a 2-month nominating process and an 8-month general election campaign, and a series of primaries and caucuses that leave much of the country, from Oregon to, yes, Florida, with little more than the role of rubber stamp. So now all of us are left waiting and waiting and waiting for Election Day to arrive, with it all too obvious that we will have to weather a gauntlet of negative campaigning and gotcha journalism to get there. So with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time. If there is any.
One of the things that I've been teaching and telling students about in the aftermath of Watergate is that there's a bias in the media that's come out of Watergate that might not be an entirely bad one, and that is, prior to Watergate, it seemed to me that there was a rather cozy relationship between much of the media and public officials, in particular the White House, and this probably, a very good anecdote of this was the presidency of FDR, right? In Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, this was a president who was a paraplegic and confined to a wheelchair, but in many instances we never saw a picture of that because it was his desire to keep that out of the media, and the number of photos that we can find today with him in the wheelchair are very limited. Others would point to the Kennedy administration and note that there were instances where the media turned a blind eye to some of the events of his administration. So what I see coming out of Watergate is what I term an anti-establishment bias, and not necessarily an entirely bad thing. And I offer as anecdotes for this. If you think of the 1992 presidential campaign, there's been some academic work done on this particular election about media bias, and it suggested that Bill Clinton, candidate Clinton, got better press coverage on the whole than the incumbent president, George Bush Sr. However, it didn't take long but at that time, as you know, President Bush was the establishment. Once President Clinton wins office, he becomes the establishment, and it appears as though the media turn on him rather quickly. Another example of this sort of phenomenon is the speakership of Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, some of you that may remember from the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s, was sort of a darling of the media, particularly the sort of Sunday morning news talk shows, and where he received a lot of attention from the media and a lot of positive attention, I think. But once the Republicans took control of Congress in 1994, Newt Gingrich was no longer the person out of power, but he was the person in power. And he was no longer the minority whip, but he was the speaker. And it turns, in this sense, I think the media turned on him rather quickly. And so on one level, it appears as though this anti-establishment bias might be a very sort of positive phenomenon, right? After all, the media, the politicians in power, right? They have their own soapbox. They have their ability to get their point out there. And if the media is working as a counterbalance, this could be a productive sort of bias for the media to hold. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that some of the anti-establishment bias is not of substantive criticisms, though, of the people in power. So that when we get the media trying to, talk about people in power and sort of expose their picadillos and their problems, there's a sort of absence of matters of substance. For instance, in 94, early 95, with the Republican Revolution, why Newt Gingrich chose to use that phrase, I'll never know, because I don't think anybody ever wanted a revolution. But when with the Contract with America, there was a lot of substance with the Contract with America, and there was a lot of things that the media could have focused on to try and provide this sort of effective anti-establishment or counterbalance. But indeed, that's not what we got. Instead, we got digging into his personal lives, his book deal, and of course, his sister was gay or something, right? And so I'm not sure that that's the effective sort of anti-establishment counterbalance that we're looking for, although perhaps it is a welcome change from an era where perhaps the media looked the other way. I just want to make one additional point about the Watergate affair and our lessons from Watergate. One clear lesson that people have talked about over the last couple of days is the fact that it's not necessarily a fact. It's the point that we have now a more open society, and that presidents, chief executives find it in their interest to not try, the same sort of things that President Nixon did, and that that ultimately they will be caught and so forth, and so that this is presumably one of the lessons of Watergate and something positive that we can take away from this experience. What I'm afraid is that there may be instances where the chief executives have learned the wrong lesson from Watergate, and that is that they've taken from Watergate the possibility that they could be caught and have become more expert in their abilities to avoid being caught. And if that was the lesson, that's not exactly what I think we would hope this would go. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to some people here who are better qualified to talk on this.
I liken the last 25 years to a game that you might find in a Chuck E. Cheese pizza parlor or another video arcade situation. That's the game where you got a big hammer and there's a little head popping out, and you bang down the head with the hammer, and then another head pops out of another hole, and you go after that head and you bang that one down, and another head pops out somewhere else. And I think every time I took my kids to Chuck E. Cheese and played that game with them, I thought of the politics that I cover. And the whole era that we've been through has been an era of evolving evasiveness by government. And I'd like to pick up on a word that Rhodes used, which is transparency. It's a catchword of the day. The president likes to talk about his plans as being transparent. Of course, with a politician, you worry when he says that also means that you can see right through it. But the idea of transparency, that we can see everything, that everything is clear to us, this is one of the real legacies of Watergate. It's a long era that we've been through, and a lot has changed from the day in which Bob Woodward was trying to figure out how a $25,000 check to the committee for the re-election of the president ended up in a Watergate burglar's bank account, to today where you can get online at www.georgewbush.com and you can find out the names of everybody who has helped raise $200,000 for the president. This goes above and beyond the call of the law. The federal law requires candidates for president to disclose who their contributors are. You can't give more than $2,000 as an individual to a presidential campaign now. And there's nothing in the law that says you have to also tell people that you have many, many friends in the business community who are really good at raising money and are capable on their own of raising $200,000 for you. And the president has hundreds of them around the country. And so he's got them on his website, and you can learn who all the Rangers are, is the designation in the Bush campaign, $200,000 fundraisers. A Pioneer is a $100,000 fundraiser, and a Maverick is a $50,000 fundraiser. And if you just give a $2,000 check, I guess that makes you a piker. But the point is that politicians feel compelled today to tell us more than they have to tell us. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's the main legacy of the Watergate era, that so much is available to us. And I'd also like to talk about a sort of a dark side to the transparency that we have today, which is that so much of the media itself has become transparent. So much of what you see on cable television and even on the network news has been reduced to an outline, just a skimming of the surface. And I'll get into this a little bit later. In Florida, we have the benefit of something that occurred really parallel and almost before Watergate, which was a full disclosure of public finances and the money that politicians have. Reuben Askew, elected governor in 1970, got the voters of the state to approve a Sunshine Amendment, which requires politicians to disclose their finances. And something you can do today as a citizen, and you can try this at home if you're a journalism student, you can go down to a public place and find out in an annual report the stock holdings, the business interests, the salaries, every disclosable financial aspect of everybody in elective office, as well as high-level managers of public government, from Orange County to the state of Florida. This, I think, is a good thing. It allows us to know what relationships exist behind the scenes. It allows us to track politicians' votes on issues and how they might relate to a financial interest that a politician has. And if people call this gotcha, well, then it is. But I think politicians who want to cross that line are basically saying, get me. And anybody who tries to operate in this era in which so much is available to us for free to look at and learn, and still wants to try to break the rules, they're basically saying, come get me. And it's the job of journalists to keep government honest, to keep government clean, and we are a watchdog. We exist. Nobody appointed us. Nobody licensed us. But we have a tradition in this country that goes back to the Bill of Rights, in which we maintain a balance in the government. Now, this is the dark side, the shrinking American newsroom. And this should be of interest to anybody here who is studying journalism. It's occurred on two fronts. On television, network television has been reduced to almost nothing. There were days when ABC and CBS and NBC all maintained reporters at the State Department, at the Defense Department, at the Energy Department, every place in Washington, and bureaus around the world and bureaus around the country. And what really changed all that was two things: satellites and cable television. Because now with satellites, everything's up on the bird. And as soon as somebody does something in France, it's up on the bird for every local television station around the United States to put it on their evening newscast. And if you look beyond the car crashes and the other sort of sordid stuff that you see on the evening news, if you look at the world news that's being presented to you, you'll see pictures. And if you look closely, you'll see that they're really detached from any reporter. These are pictures that have come in from the sky. They're available for WESH, which I also happen to think is a very fine local television station that really commits a lot of resources to public interest. But it allows stations like them to just pull down everything available to them and show it to you without the benefit of a reporter. And what you have sitting in front of you is a very, very attractive newsreader who spent a lot of time in makeup and can read really well and works great with a teleprompter and never stumbles on a word and can talk for 2 hours straight, but doesn't know anything that he or she is talking about. And that's largely what you're looking at on television today. The esteemed old networks of CBS, and CBS in particular, have been reduced to a small market share of the television viewer. Today, you've got so many options on TV that you can go to CNN, you can go to MSNBC, you can get everything instantly. You don't have to wait for Dan Rather at 6:30 in the evening or whatever time. You can get it right now, and as a result, all the networks are competing for a diminishing share of the market. Even CNN, absent a major crisis, is watched by very few people at any given point in the day. They're all talking to a fragment of the market. And people are also seeking out their own customized TV. People are going to Fox News for a more conservative view of the news to counterbalance what they see as the liberal bias in the media. And that's fine. Everybody has the option to look at what they want to look at. But that shrinking newsroom, that shrinking television is really giving us less information, not more information. We're not learning a lot from the television these days. And unfortunately, the newspapers of this country are shrinking as well. And this has to do with declining readership. Maybe we're doing it to ourselves. Maybe we're writing about the wrong things. We're not interesting people. My son, who's a great guitar player, says to me, why do you cover politics? He says, Bill Clinton, Eric Clapton, Bill Clinton, Eric Clapton. What's more interesting? And, I got to give it to him, Eric Clapton on most days of the week. But the fact is that fewer people are reading. It's tough for newspapers to keep making money the way they need to stay in business. And as a result, the staffs of American newspapers and magazines is dwindling. So it makes it tough for all you young folks who aspire to this glamorous career of journalism that was so adulated by all the president's men. It's tough. There's less of it. But I think what it requires, and this is the good news, is smart, creative people. People that can distinguish themselves through their writing and their intelligence. It's a tougher market, but it demands brighter people. In the era that you're living in, if you're seeking a profession, or if you're not, if you're a voter, I encourage you to take advantage of what's out there, to use the internet for its good purposes, for the public sites that provide you with information about politics and your government. The campaigns all now run very full websites. You can look at all their television ads if you care to, and you can look at the critiques of the competing campaigns as well. And I encourage everybody to take advantage of that, because this is in fact one of the things we have gained from Watergate. There is a lot available to us. And unfortunately, in light of the way things are changing in the media, I think it also requires that a lot of you take it upon yourselves to learn things for yourselves. But it's out there, and that's our legacy, I believe.
One of the good things about being the last person is that you can kind of wrap it up, and they've used some of my material. And one of the things that Mark and I talked about, too, is we would like to interchange with you, too, and give you the opportunity to ask some questions. And the way I look at Watergate, I was there with Lou Frey. We went up there in 1969, and what I want to share with you is the mood of the Congress, the mood of the President, and what was going on at that point. As far as President Nixon, he was the President, and he was the imperial President. You had Ed Gurney, who was the senator from here, and then you had Lou Frey. It was a mood in Washington in which you could do no wrong. You had if you worked for a congressman, my goodness, you were really a hot shot. If depending in rank, if you were a legislative assistant, you were okay. But if you were the chief of staff, boy, you had really done something well. And then even more so, if you were a congressman, that was really something. And it was a time when reporting wasn't available. Well, if it was, the media looked another way. It was an understanding that you did what you did, and you tried to pass some good laws. And if you did not, that was, well, we're sorry about that. It was a development of a mood in which you want to belong to it. I remember that prior to Watergate, the president had given the congressmen and others the opportunity to go and make the Republican Party the majority party, and really put the philosophy of the Republican Party in vogue. And prior to Watergate, just shortly to Watergate, there was a group that got together, and they had pledges of 72 congressmen that were Democrats that were going to switch parties so the Republican Party could become the majority. And it was elation. Back then, I don't know, you probably don't remember this. Well, you don't. You weren't born. The Secretary of Commerce, Maurice Stans, he was the President's finance chairman. And he would come in with buckets of monies. I mean, just buckets. And whatever was raised, what was needed was raised. And there was no reporting, like Mark said, and there was no accountability. And that was the mood. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the Republican Party suffered for that. That's when I go and look at afterwards. You had a very decent person in Gerald Ford who became the president, and one of the reasons was because President Nixon wanted him to be the vice president, so that he perhaps would have some support in the House of Representatives as the moods were changing. But here, a very decent man who knew the ways and ends of Washington, who was perfect for after Watergate. To this day, many people will probably agree with me that one of the problems was that when he pardoned Richard Nixon, that's just part of history. Then afterwards, after Watergate, if you were a member of Congress, you weren't respected. There's polls that are taken. It was the equivalent of you being a car salesman. You were below a car salesman. And one of the unfortunate things thereafter is the Republican Party started to decline. And then it gave the Democrats, regardless of your philosophy, it gave them the opportunity to really not have a good opponent or another side of philosophy.
Mark, you pointed something correctly about the transparency, which is one of the legacy of Watergate. But my question is, I fail to see any relationship between Watergate and the shrinking media. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, I'm not sure there is a direct relationship between Watergate and the shrinking media. I think the shrinking media has to do with the finances that newspapers and television are operating under today. They're two different things. I mentioned cable TV, the fact that broadcast networks are competing for a smaller market share, therefore making less money with their advertising. Newspapers are shrinking, therefore making less money with their advertising. These are economic factors that are happening, and I don't think they're directly related to Watergate.
I was kind of thinking, that we've been talking of the media almost like it's a monolith, and it's not. There's a lot of different parts with a lot of different political persuasions to it. Even back in the Watergate era, you had this kind of the Eastern Bloc, which the Nixon administration was so unhappy with, like basically the great family-owned papers, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and some of the powerful networks like CBS. But each time Richard Nixon ran, 60, 68, 72, he got a majority of the newspapers around the country to endorse him. Out in the rest of the country, the publishers liked him a lot, and their papers endorsed him. Some were chains, some were individual papers, what have you. But I think what Nixon ran into is a problem that basically, with his predicament, his side of the media became more silent and more quiet, while the other side became more vocal. So he wasn't getting the support out there, just like it was said last night, I guess, by Bob Woodward. Maybe what did Richard Nixon in ultimately was the lack of the Republicans on Capitol Hill who supported him. But that was also mirrored in the press around the country. I mean, as the Watergate went on, I think the normally Republican press, I think, became quieter, while the more liberal press became louder. And it became a bit of an uneven fight then. But now, I think in the current context of the 50-50, I think that if you look at the various aspects of the media, they probably balance out a bit more evenly. I mean, you still have that northeastern press or whatever, which is going to be liberal, though the Washington Post did support the Bush administration on the war in Iraq. You have the networks, which may be fading a bit, TV, but you have cable TV, in which there's a strong conservative influence now that wasn't there a generation ago. You have talk radio, which is a strong conservative influence that wasn't there a generation ago. And then you have the regular, the papers out in the country who, probably many of them are still very Republican. So, I mean, if things got very controversial again, and I think they will, I mean, this is going to be a heated campaign, I think both sides have powerful assets in the media.
As a footnote, I think there's an intriguing aspect to your question, which is that it's not just a 50-50 world that we're living in today, it's also a very polarized world. If you read the opinion polls, and the Pew Center for Research in Washington, which is financed by the oil industry basically, but a foundation finance group, but they do great research, and go online, pewresearch.com, you look at the polling that's been done in the American public, and people aren't just disagreeing, they're disagreeing hugely. I mean, the people who support George Bush support him by margins of 85%. The people who support John Kerry similarly. I mean, there's no middle ground. There's very little middle ground. And if the media can play a role in that whole situation, it is perhaps, what's the proper word, diffusing maybe the sharp, rhetoric that we have coming from both sides, and stop portraying the world in shades of left and right, and start talking about more middle ground issues. And yeah, I mean, including a spectrum. People talk about looking at both sides of an issue. There's not both sides. There's many sides. And I think that's the media's responsibility, to stop portraying everything in terms of a left-right dogfight.
We thank the panel members for their participation today. And before we wrap this up, we'd like to call on our host, Congressman Lou Frey, for a moment.
Thank you very much, panel. Oscar and I developed a couple rules of politics very early on. The only two rules we live by. Rule number one, don't get in a fight with someone who buys their ink by the carload, the press. And rule number two, you have to explain you're in trouble. Because as a politician, once you start explaining, it's over. You go on and on and on. And I have a healthy respect and affection for the press, but I always remembered that they had their job to do and I had my job to do, and they don't necessarily always match. A congressman is trying to get his ideas and his story out to the press, what they want. The press wants to write its story, so there's a healthy difference in the way they approach it, and I think that's extremely important to the way our country works. The press shouldn't take what I say just as verbatim, nor do I want to turn myself inside out to the press, and I think that's an important thing. The other thing I'm very proud of with the Institute over a period of time, and I've tried to do that myself, is I think today that your righteousness equals your volume. And the louder you can scream at somebody, the righter you are. I mean, even in sports, and I love sports, you can't get a sports show on today without people screaming at each other instead of talking about the issues. There's no one party or one person who has all the answers, my friends, in our country. These issues are complex. They're difficult. I can look at some things I did right. I can look at some things I'd like to do over. I can look at some things today I don't know if I'm right or wrong. And you struggle with it, and you try and do it, and there's nothing wrong with those kind of discussions. But I think what we've lost is the ability of people to disagree without truly being disagreeable. We've lost the opportunity, like Elizabeth Holtzman, I guess she left, but she's a close friend of mine, and Elizabeth Holtzman's voting record and mine are probably not too close together. And there's no reason. I mean, she's from New York City. She has a different viewpoint of life than I do, but yet we do agree on a lot of basic things. And because we just disagree on some issues doesn't mean she's bad or I'm bad. It means we just honestly disagree, and we go on from there. Again, let me say, too, when we close, to President Hitton at the university, and not just the political science department, everybody, it has been a privilege to be involved with the university. It's a great university. It's, to me, one of the great universities, not in the state, but the nation, and it's only going to get better. And it's nice that we can tag along a little bit and have a small part to play in it. By the way, the next one we're having, and we have them scheduled every 6 months, so you know. In October of this year, we're going to have one that the title is, I'm not sure what the title is, but basically it's the space program, Does It Have a Future? And we've got John Glenn, Bill Nelson, the head of the space program. We're going to have a whole bunch of people here, some of whom like it, some whom don't. I was on the space committee. I handled the space shuttle from day one, and I've got some personal strong feelings about it. I care about it, but there are a lot of people who don't care about it, and or think we ought to spend money for other things, and I think that'll be an interesting thing. Once again, thank you for coming, and for some of you who are a little younger than some of us here, maybe the whole Watergate thing still is somewhat of a mystery to you as you go along, but it was one of the most important events in our political history. I think if someone up here said they're going to be studying this 60 or 100 years from now, and maybe as you get along, the next time this comes up, it'll ring a bell somewhere. But we appreciate your patience. We thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much.